Why watch? Well, if you want to be on the cutting edge of what's coming, and if you want to really know how your workplace is going to be impacted and how you can develop your career as an intrapreneur and what it means for you, then you should definitely watch this video.
Our next guest has a PhD in creative problem solving and a master's in adult education. She has been a practitioner in the fields of workplace innovation and creativity long before they became new imperatives. And she's on a mission to liberate underutilized talent within our workplaces, both in the public and the private sector. She has written 2 highly popular books on the subject, and her 3rd book, called Solution-Centered Teams, will be out later this year. She founded the Australian Entrepreneur Summit and is the founder and editor-in-chief of Intrapreneur magazine. And she's here to share her experience and insight with us. Please welcome Dr. Irena Yashin-Shaw.
This whole concept of entrepreneurialism is taking the world by storm. So if anyone wants to be on the cutting edge of the newest movement that is impacting on the world of work, they should watch this video because intrapreneurialism is really about is about how the world is transforming itself right now. So it's not something that's only affecting one industry or one workplace or even just one country. It's actually something that's affecting everyone, everywhere, globally. So it's something that I believe is going to impact on every workplace and has the potential to unlock the next wave of productivity and profitability within organizations and businesses. So why watch? Well, if you want to be on the cutting edge of what's coming, and if you want to really know how your workplace is going to be impacted and how you can develop your career as an intrapreneur and what it means for you, then you should definitely watch this video.
Now, with this global movement, do you see any changes in particular areas, particularly regions are more likely to take this on? Or is there any, do you see a variability in the marketplace? The world is a big place. Do you see any differences between countries or regions? Or
well, that's an interesting question. Let me put that into context. So given that we're doing this interview in Australia, I would say that Australia is a little bit behind the times here. So entrepreneurialism is really big in Europe right now. Well, it's bigger in Europe than it is in Australia. It's much more nascent in Australia than it is in Europe and the US, but it's still nascent everywhere. It's interesting to note that there is a lot of interest in entrepreneurialism in Africa. And what could happen is that some of the emerging economies sort of like grab onto this idea and then just almost leapfrog ahead in terms of the way they use innovation to progress their economies and literally transform. So my impression, and it's early days because there's not a lot of really great research about this because it's still a relatively new topic. So my impression, in answer to your question, is that it's more established as a movement in Europe, less so in Australia, but definitely emerging very strongly in developing countries like Africa.
Why Africa, though?
Because they are hungry for change, and they are in this wonderful space where they're looking for how to increase their standard of living, And one of the interesting things about developing countries is that they don't have all of those legacy systems to retire before they can move forward. And so even when you look at things like that wonderful entrepreneurial initiative by Vodafone, where they introduced something called M-Pesa in Kenya, I think it was, they had to find a way of being able to transfer small amounts of money. And so Vodafone came up with this wonderful method of transferring it via mobile phone. So that's what's called M-Pesa. M for mobile, Pesa stands for money. because they didn't have the infrastructure for people to be able to go and go to banks, and people didn't have bank accounts, and how do you put something like this in and give everyone access to money transfer when they don't even have a bank account, right? So instead of going through the traditional route that we might have, because we expect everyone to have a bank account and make everyone open a bank account, they just came up with this alternative way of doing business, which is to transfer small amounts of money via mobile phone. Now, that was an intrapreneurial initiative. It was launched back in 2007, and by 2013, something like 40% of the country's GDP was being channeled through this method of payment.
Wow.
And so they didn't have those big sort of like infrastructure legacy systems that we need to negotiate when we have changes and when we want to do things differently. So in some ways, there's no barriers to innovation in developing countries. Like, they can just leapfrog over developed countries who've got this established way of doing things and all of the legacy systems that we have to deal with. So that's kind of my take on why that would have happened. I use it as one of the case studies in my book. So I'm holding up my book, and it was one of the case studies that I looked at. I was fascinated by it, and yes, it was an initiative by someone inside Vodafone, and it was supported by Vodafone, and they got a grant from the British government as well to assist with it. And yeah, it was a hugely successful intrapreneurial initiative. So it came from inside of the organisation. And the person who floated it was actually an employee, a very senior employee, admittedly, of Vodafone, and was able to use the resources of the big corporation that he was a part of in order to be able to progress this wonderful idea.
I can just imagine if you were to do that as an entrepreneur, or with your own, off your own bat, if you like, having to go through the process of, you can't fund it. This is a big project.
Exactly.
Going to the meetings, going to all these hurdle rates that you have to go. No doubt the person in Vodafone also had hurdle rates to overcome in terms of their own internal requirements, whether they should fund something like that or not. But because it's inside, I suspect it would be an easier journey.
Well, not necessarily, but the difference here, and the point that you started to make, was, someone who was an entrepreneur as a startup, who say they wanted to start that as a business, they just wouldn't have had the resources at their disposal. And this is why intrapreneurship and intrapreneurialism can be such a powerful force for good globally. It's because it really galvanizes the internal resources and what's available in terms of both people resources, financial resources, and reach, to be able to make really spectacularly big things like that M-Pesa initiative take flight. Whereas entrepreneurs, especially if they're sort of in their early stages and they're fledgling, or if they're a startup, they don't have those resources at their disposal. So they're very limited with what they can do in the short term. So it's one of the reasons why I actually believe that this global movement is finding its legs, or I should actually say, let me rephrase that, finding its wings and taking off. It's because we're realizing that we need to mobilize corporate resources in the service of advancing the good of humanity as well as society, as well as serving the purpose of the organization.
We talked a little about the entrepreneurship. Do you see any similarities between them? And I guess the adjunct question to that is, what's the differences that would define one from the other? Okay,
all right. So I guess we didn't even start off right at the beginning talking about what is an intrapreneur, what is intrapreneurialism. Maybe we can just take a step back and find that, and then we can talk about what's different, what's the same. So intrapreneurialism is about thinking and acting like an entrepreneur while working inside an organization.
Okay.
Large or small, businesses, SMEs, not-for-profit, any organization at all, will have people inside the organization that come to work every day with an enterprising spirit. Now, the challenge for that organization is to tap into that enterprising spirit to release those great ideas so that they can create value.
Yep.
So intrapreneurialism is about releasing that enterprising potential within an organization versus entrepreneurialism, which is about exiting an organization or starting off on your own and creating a venture that's external to a large organization, right?
Yep.
Now, so that would be the difference. It's the context. The similarities are that whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're an intrapreneur, you've got to have a few characteristics. Like, for example, you really need a passion for what you're doing, and both intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs are about creating something, right? So they see a problem, they want to solve it. They see an opportunity, they want to develop it. So they create something that does not exist as yet. They either make something better or they introduce a new revenue stream. So I'd say that the similarities are the fire in the belly. So they've got that drive to want to use their creativity for good in some way, and that they've got a sense of their own, I would say, agency, like a sense of agency in that they believe that they can make a difference. Just going back to the differences, I'd say one of the key differences is that intrapreneurs, because they're inside of an organization as they try to bring change, often need to negotiate a lot of corporate politics, which, entrepreneurs, especially if it's their own business and they're still in startup or even if they're relatively small, they don't have those constraints. So there's a really different modus operandi in the two different contexts. And I guess the other difference would be too that entrepreneurs need to have probably a higher risk appetite. That's not to say that entrepreneurialism doesn't have its own risks, for sure. But, entrepreneurs, when they step out and they bet on themselves and they invest everything, they could go out of business and they could lose everything. Whereas an intrapreneur is likely, I'll say likely, not 100% certain, likely to still have a job if their entrepreneurial initiative doesn't quite work out as they had hoped. So, there are a few similarities, there are a few differences, but the key point is that they both have that really, that driving passion to create something that doesn't exist yet.
I guess the currency that they operate from is, there's always a price to pay somewhere along the line, whether it's money or reputation in terms of the intrapreneurship and money in terms of entrepreneurship. So the currency is quite different. And I suspect, you pointed out on the risk profile, I suspect the risks are different as well. But, if somebody loses their job, or particularly with a company they've grown to love, that is quite a big price to pay in its own right. Is that holding people back, you think?
I was having a conversation just yesterday with someone. We were having a coffee meeting, and we were talking about this issue. And somewhere or another, he was saying that he'd read about how a number one characteristic of an intrapreneur. And I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but it's an interesting thought. Number one characteristic is that you turn up every day prepared to lose your job.
Interesting. Yes.
That is really putting everything on the line in the way that an entrepreneur might. But apart from that, I think you're right. There are different currencies, and there are different payoffs. There are different systems, and there's probably different approaches to developing ideas, whether you're an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur. I think still, for a lot of entrepreneurs, progressing initiatives internally within an organization does feel risky because they've got a lot of barriers to negotiate. And if it doesn't work out, you know, it's not just their own personal reputation that could be damaged. You know, it could cost the company, and so the impact will be, you know, the ripple effect of that could impact on many people's lives and livelihoods. It could be their whole team that actually ends up, you know, being tarred with the same brush. But the same. But you know, that depends on the environment that you're working in. And I think good organisations, progressive organisations who are prepared to back their intrapreneurs, give them permission to make mistakes. They give them an environment in which if they fail, provided it's not, you know, a total disaster, they give them some leeway. They'll give them some credit at least for trying. But those are the organisations that have over time developed an environment of trust, and that is so important, because unless people feel that, you know, it's not just lip service on the part of the organisation saying, oh, we want your great ideas, we want you to step up, we want you to, you know, be prepared to do something different and we'll support you if you fail. And then if they do, you know, it's just a disaster, then no one else is ever going to do it. You know, because if they see someone who takes that risk and isn't supported, if they see them being, you know, punished for that, then that will really kill the entrepreneurial initiative on the part of many other people. Yeah, there's an apocryphal story, Hans, that I don't know the source of it. I think it's a true story, but it's one of those, you know, stories that's been told in so many incarnations that I've got no idea where the origin of it is. It goes something like this, where a manager tried something new, and it could have been a magnificent outcome if it had worked, but it didn't, and it actually cost the company like $1 million, and it was a disaster. And he thought he was going to get fired as a result, because, you know, the CEO called him into his office, and he went in completely prepared to be dismissed because he knew that his initiative had failed. And the CEO sat him down and said, "Okay, so what did you learn from this? You know, what would you do differently if you had to do it again?" And it was like, you know, okay, so you've learned your lesson and you know now how you would do things differently. And the manager said to the CEO, "Oh, you mean I'm not fired?" And the CEO said, "I've just paid $1 million for your education. You're not going anywhere." But provided we actually take the time to reflect on what we do, so that we do learn from mistakes, but we also learn from successes.
Oh, yes.
And provided we put that time into reflection, it's time well spent. But most workplaces are so busy that when they finish something, they just zoom straight on to the next one without actually taking that time to debrief and say, well, what did we learn from this and what succeeded, but we could still have done even better next time round. And I just think there's just not enough of that kind of reflection done within organisations and businesses, and it's such a wasted opportunity for improving performance.
Oh, indeed. And I, from my perspective, that same issue happens in entrepreneur land as well. Yeah. Insofar as, you know, somebody may do everything they could, failed, and they go and give up, which is a very, very common thing. And I mean, I'm okay about them giving up on the particular project they were pursuing, but don't give up on your dream. Just do it another way. But they never get to that process of figuring out the other way. They'll lick wounds and then that's it. You know, I've done my entrepreneurial thing, and oftentimes it's under pressure from loved ones and family and friends who say, you know, the 2020 vision, I knew you would always fail. That sort of stuff happens a lot. And it's an absolute downer, which is not necessary, and it should never happen to somebody. You know, we should be celebrating their enterprise for going there, whether it's within a company or outside of a company, because that's what grows economies. You know, doing the same old is not going to grow an economy. Exactly.
Yeah, good point.
So what advice would you give somebody if they're considering about becoming an intrapreneur?
I would say be bold and brave. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do is to step out of our comfort zone. And if you've got a great idea, number one, we have to believe in it ourselves. So if you're an entrepreneur and you've got an idea, number one, you need to believe in it, and you actually need to be prepared to commit to it if you want to be the person who progresses it. But the point is that if you don't step up and say something and do something, and that often requires us to step out of our comfort zone big time, no one's going to know about it. You can't be an entrepreneur if you've got an idea that never sees the light of day. Exactly. You know, you might have that fire in your belly and you want to do something. So probably the most important thing is to take action and to be brave enough to speak up and bring that idea to the attention of whoever it needs to be, and then do whatever it takes to progress it.
Is there a lot of politics involved within the entrepreneurship to do that in terms of the hurdle rate?
Hans, look, that's as in Australia, as we say, in case you've got viewers from all other countries of the world, that question, the answer to it is as long as a piece of string. We say that here in Australia. So, the amount of politics that people need to negotiate, the amount of egos, all of that will depend on the nature of the initiative, what level the person is at, who's trying to progress it, how ready the organisation is for entrepreneurialism, how well the ground has been prepared beforehand. So there's really no one response to that other than to say that anytime you're working inside a large organisation and you've got a lot of moving parts who need to be part of an initiative, there's a lot of conversations that need to be had in order to bring projects to fruition.
So it's also a matter then of the quality of your communication.
Oh, very much so, very much so. And I think one of the key qualities that an intrapreneur needs to have is that of being influential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that means being able to communicate ideas really well. That means being able to collaborate effectively with other people. That means having an effective network that will help them to distribute their ideas, people who trust that person. All of those things, communication, collaboration, networks, all of that contributes to someone being able to be influential. I think it's one of those skills that people really need to focus on. If they were going to pour some effort into a particular area to develop, that would be one of them. Absolutely.
Do you think it's something that can be learned?
Influencing skills?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely. I think just about everything can be learned. Everything can be learned. And it's not like, it's... I'm never going to learn to play basketball. Okay, let's. So there might be some limitations on what we can learn. I'm never going to learn to be an astronaut, right?
Yeah.
But within reason, we can learn anything that we want to. So entrepreneurial skills in general can be learned, like creativity can be learned. All of these skills that we think are sort of like we're either born with or not can be learned. Influencing skills are like 101. They're probably one of the most important, fundamental professional skills for anyone to develop when they enter the workforce, and there's lots of ways of learning those. I mean, we've got access to unlimited information now. You can watch YouTube videos and learn how to do it. The key factor is your commitment to learning that skill. So just having a desire for it is not enough. We have to do something about it. Just watching a YouTube video or going to a workshop or listening to a speaker talk about it, not enough, right? We might be introduced to those concepts through those channels, but then we need to really be prepared to change our behavior and then take those principles on into our professional practice and put them into our everyday life until they become embedded. But absolutely, I believe we can learn it. Not a doubt in the world.
I guess you really need a big why you want to do that. And if the why is big enough, you'll learn those absolute skills.
Yep, totally agree. And that applies to anything. Wasn't it Simon Sinek's most famous TED Talk, Start With Why?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, indeed.
Like that. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If we've got a reason to do something, we'll make it happen, you know. So people who lose motivation in various ways, it's because they've just, you know, they don't have a big enough why, or sometimes when things don't go well. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. We've got to be motivated to put our heart and soul into something, and that starts with a big why.
And I guess motivation is the slippery slope as well. I mean, it's easy to lose it, and you have to keep trawling through your own psyche and your own emotional state to keep it up and maintain it for a long time. And that's not always easy. But you know, I totally agree with you. Without motivation, without a big why, you shouldn't be starting these sorts of things, whether it's intrapreneurship or entrepreneurship.
Yeah, look, you know, one of the keys to successful intrapreneurship or entrepreneurship is being resilient. You know, I think we need to go into this space with our eyes wide open, with the expectation that things are not going to go smoothly. So if you go in with that mindset of, I'm going to have a lot of hurdles to jump over. I'm going to have a lot of hoops to jump through. The road is not going to be easy. So if we go into anything, you know, whether it's an intrapreneurial or an entrepreneurial initiative with that attitude, if things are easy, then it's a bonus, you know, but don't expect it to be. Don't expect it to be. And I think that's the sort of thing that helps us to develop what we might call grit or resilience. You know, when we're prepared to continue in the face of obstacles that will rob us of our energy and that will sap us of our, you know, our capacities and our motivation and, you know, all of those things. If we can still get up the next morning and go, no, I'm still pursuing this because I believe in it, then you know, that's a very important element in success.
So we've kind of talked a little bit about this question, but it's worth asking anyway. What do you think are the top 3 skills an entrepreneur need to be successful?
All right, so there's a whole suite of them. In my book, I actually talk about the 12 skills or qualities that an entrepreneur needs for success. But if I was to say the top 3, I would say number 1, without a doubt, is having what we'll call a growth orientation, and that is closely related to having a growth mindset. Now, you might be familiar with Carol Dweck's work around this. He wrote the book Mindset. That whole area is about, you know, a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Do we see challenges as opportunities, or do we see challenges as obstacles because we've reached the edge of our competence? So number 1 is a growth mindset where we are prepared to step out of our comfort zone. You can't be an entrepreneur inside your comfort zone, right? It's just they are...
It's an oxymoron, isn't it?
they won't work. That does work. So we need to be prepared to step out of our comfort zone, which means that we need to be prepared to silence those negative voices that inevitably surface in our minds when we start taking on challenges that feel risky and threatening. So anytime we're doing something that's, you know, challenging, there will often be that little voice, that monkey that'll jump on our shoulders going, oh, you're going to crash and burn. Oh, you're going to fail. You're going to make a fool of yourself. And what's everyone going to think of you? And who do you think you are? You know, all of those voices that sometimes surface. And entrepreneurs need to, like entrepreneurs, they need to be able to flick those monkeys off their shoulder and replay that script, silence the monkeys and believe in themselves to the extent that they go, okay, no, I can do this. I'm going to step out of my comfort zone. I'm going to bet on myself, and I'm going to have a go. So nothing will happen until that. So I would say having a growth orientation is number one. Number two, I would say, would be being iconoclastic. So an iconoclast is someone who challenges the status quo, all right? Historically, it's people who have challenged established beliefs. So in a modern context, intrapreneurs are iconoclasts because they ask, why are we doing it this way? Isn't there a better way to do it? Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean we can't do it differently going forward. So they challenge business as usual thinking. So without those kinds of challenges and those kinds of questions being asked, progress isn't made. So entrepreneurs need to be prepared to, be polemicists. So a polemicist is someone who is really good at arguing stuff. So polemics is the art and science of argumentation, of asking questions, sometimes difficult and confronting ones, and thereby shining a light on what isn't working so that progress can be made. Right, yeah. So that would be probably number two, being prepared to challenge the status quo, be a polemicist, be the person who asks the difficult questions, even though you sometimes will see people roll their eyes when you do it. At the end of a meeting, someone puts their hand up and goes, the entrepreneur in the room will go, oh, but have we thought about doing it this way? And you can just feel everyone else in the room going, oh, not you again, or you can feel the sighs, and everyone's going, we just have to be prepared to wear that and, do it anyway.
Yeah, that's where groupthink comes into play as well. The rest of the group has this common headspace, and they're comfortable and safe in that, and then it almost becomes like the group attacking the individual who challenges their groupthink, and they're almost their being, if you like.
Actually, that is a really, really good point, because groupthink is so common within organizations. And it is one of the most dangerous phenomena because people don't know it's happening. But we don't realize that it's happened, and so people start agreeing with each other, and it leads to really bad decisions. So if we're aspiring to be an intrapreneur, what's really important is to maintain independent thought and maintain our intellectual distance to some extent, but to be prepared to, receive things from a different point of view so that we don't get sucked into an echo chamber. People, we live in echo chambers these days. We tend to hang out with people who think the same way. The way the algorithms are evolving on social media, we get shown things that the algorithms think that we want to hear. And so we're starting to live in these echo chambers where our perspectives and our worldviews are never challenged. We need that. We need those challenges to keep our thinking fresh. So that's what will prevent groupthink. And so, yes, that's a very closely related concept to being iconoclastic and being a polemicist. So Hans, you asked me for three things, or you asked me for a few things, and I've said growth mindset. I said be iconoclastic. I'd say the third one would be having determination, and just recognizing that there's no substitute for persistence. And that I know we've talked about it a little bit before already. We've touched on the importance of this, but if we don't have that kind of like drive to keep going when we might hit a hurdle, then we're actually probably not likely to achieve too much. So we do need to be really determined. Now, I just want to make a distinction as I say that. I'm thinking about the fact that we actually need to walk that line between being so determined that we don't listen to other perspectives because we're just like the steamroller pushing through on a particular path. And I think we need to temper that determination with good judgment so that if it comes to the point where we actually need to let something go and go, okay, this isn't working, I need to pivot somewhere else or I need to try something differently, that we've got enough good judgment to know when to do that as well. So maybe determination is the overarching concept, but not to the extent where we're not prepared to listen or think with other perspectives as well.
I guess it's a determination tempered by self-awareness.
Yes,
that allows
exactly.
you to walk that line. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. And good judgment.
Indeed,
And the more judgment calls we make, the more experienced we become. So.
Oh, indeed. And it stops the failures from happening, because if you make lots of decisions, you have little failures rather than one big one at the end of it all, where
Exactly.
maybe it's very difficult to recover from.
Exactly.
Yeah. But certainly, as far as I'm concerned, a big part of entrepreneurship, and I suspect with intrapreneurship as well, it's managing your risk and do it really quickly. Don't let things run.
Yeah.
And if you do need to pivot, allow yourself to pivot and don't see that as a failure. Yeah. It's maybe the failure of that particular decision you took earlier that now needs to be undone, but it doesn't make you a failure. And that's Correct. A big difference between those two. And a lot of people kind of get lost in that whole, they equate themselves with the project rather than seeing the project as something they do. They become the project, and it becomes hard for them to admit that they were wrong.
Yeah, that is so true. And what you've just said about mitigating risk, I think is actually quite an important point to maybe explore just slightly, because one of the main barriers to entrepreneurship within organisations is risk aversion. And especially if you're working in highly risk averse organisations like government departments. I do a lot of work in government. So one of the reasons why sometimes the public sector has the reputation of not being particularly innovative, which, by the way, is not at all true. But one of the reasons for that is because there is this sense of risk aversion. So a good way of mitigating that risk is to make lots of small decisions, as you just said before, instead of committing to a course of action and then seeing, after you've committed a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of energy down the track, that it's not going to work. So Christian Bason, who wrote a wonderful book called Leading Public Sector Innovation, he said, a quote directly from that book, if I can remember it correctly, he said, fail early to succeed sooner.
Yeah.
Isn't that wise? I thought that's so clever. Fail early to succeed sooner, because if we fail early, what we're doing is not actually failing. We're just figuring out quickly what isn't working, so that we're not going to burn resources and we're not going to waste resources on a course of action that's clearly not going to deliver what it was supposed to or intended to. So if we can the earlier that we can figure that out, the better off we are, and the more likely we are to deliver a good outcome faster.
Absolutely. I guess in the entrepreneurial world there's something similar. It's called fail fast. Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. And can I go back to your earlier comment about the public sector and its perceived lack of innovation? I don't quite know the exact statistics, so I'm not going to quote them, but I believe that the majority of new products actually have come from the public sector. Now, when you throw the public sector net wide, it includes the military, it includes all the R&D, public sector R&D agencies, it includes the universities. That's where a lot of the fundamental work is being done that allows it, that in an environment that is not necessarily driven by quarterly results, a listed entity. So it allows for the flexibility to pursue an idea without necessarily having to report it to a fickle market. And they're not good at commercializing it, but that's not what their job is anyway. And then this commercialization, transferring the technology, that's a whole different story.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with you on that, and I'm glad that you circled back to that point, because in fact there are many very intrapreneurial people working within this public sector. I mean, we have to admit that there's a lot of bureaucracy as well that they have to contend with. But indeed, some of the greatest social innovations have come from the public sector. Yeah, absolutely.
Totally.
I'm thinking what just dropped into my mind just then as I said that is like maternity leave. That was a massive social innovation, and that was started in the public sector. So, but that's a big one that ripples throughout all of society. But, there are lots of small initiatives being undertaken every day on a much smaller scale within many government departments by intrapreneurs who are making people's lives better. And many people actually join the public sector for that reason, because they have a strong sense of social conscience and social good and want to serve in that capacity. And that's why they join the public sector. So there's lots of people working in that way.
And I'm really glad you quoted an example of innovation that's not technology driven or product driven. This is a service innovation. And so few people understand and realize that a lot of innovation is actually nothing to do with a new product. It's about creating a new process, or it's a different way of thinking about something, and it's just as innovative as somebody creating a new mobile phone, for instance.
Oh, I'm so pleased you said that, because I live and breathe this stuff. I sometimes forget to say it, because to me that is so obvious that I don't make that distinction as often as I should. And so I'm so glad you picked up on that, because you're right. For many people, innovation is about technology. It's just equated with technology. Oh, are you ready for innovation? No, technology. But so they assume immediately that innovation equals technology. Couldn't be further from the truth. Sure, new technology represents innovation, and when you introduce new technology into an organisation, that is an innovation, but that's a subset. That's a small part of this big globe, much bigger concept of innovation. And if I can even take that even further and put that concept on steroids, I think of innovation as not even something that we do, it's something that we be. Right?
Yes.
So that's it's really getting it away from technology now.
Yep.
But of course, it's a way of life, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of approaching our work and how we solve problems, and always looking for new opportunities to bring change and positive improvements. And innovation, and this is a real aha that a lot of people say to me that they have after doing one of my workshops or whatever. They often say that their biggest takeaway was that they realised that innovation can be small incremental improvements as much as big ticket items.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if you add up all of those small improvements over a period of time that someone might be engaging in, over a period of 12 months, those small improvements can lead to massive changes in productivity and profitability and all sorts of improvements. But because there's small improvements iteratively implemented, they don't look like they're a big innovation. And so people go, oh, that doesn't really count as innovation, but it does.
Can I add to that? When you look at most of the patents that are being taken out, for a long time now, the thing that's actually patented is a small component of our overall system. So it could be, the thing may be a box, but it's not the box that's patented. It's the screw that holds the box together that's patented.
Right.
And it's that sort of shifting thinking that will open up a whole heap of opportunities.
Yeah.
That you don't always have to, look for the whole. You need to look at the parts that make up the whole. And,
exactly.
And cumulatively, it actually makes a big difference.
Yep. Yeah. Good point. Agree.
So what key activities would you recommend that an entrepreneur should invest in order to achieve what they want to achieve?
What should they invest in? Okay, let me just talk about two. So first of all, I would say invest in developing their creativity, right, and their creative problem-solving skills, because the concept of creativity, a little bit like innovation, is a little bit misunderstood. People think, oh, you're either born creative or you're not, or you've been gifted this quality or you haven't. And if you haven't, well, there's no hope for you. Okay, well, that's a complete myth. I always say to people, it is absolutely rubbish. And if you've got a brain and a pulse, you can be creative. There's pretty much everyone. So number one is to get past that thinking about creativity as being only about the lone genius working. That's a bird outside my door.
I know. Oh, okay.
The lone genius beavering away somewhere in their parents' garage, coming up with the next big thing. But changing the view of creativity from that to being an everyday activity. So every time we challenge our thinking to step outside of the norm, every time we ask ourselves the question, can I do this differently? How can I solve this problem in a new way? What would I see if I put different perspective on this situation? That's people actually using their creativity. Absolutely. Because we're stepping outside the norm.
Yep.
So creativity for many people is about the arts. They go, oh, I'm not very creative because I can't paint, or I'm not very creative because I don't write music, or I haven't written a best-selling novel recently, or they immediately associate it exclusively with the arts in some way. Whereas creativity is an everyday activity, and it's about cognitive flexibility, the preparedness to think differently, and be prepared to take a route that's not well travelled. So not relying on our existing neural networks, our existing ways of solving a problem, but doing it differently. Of course, I'm very familiar with this whole concept about how you give 5-year-olds a creativity test and they'll come across as being very creative. You give adults a similar test and not so creative. I have a slightly different perspective on that.
Okay.
And part of the reason why we don't think like that anymore as we grow up is because we develop schemas in our life to help us to navigate our complex world. So I'm just going to call, if you don't mind, if you're going to indulge me for a little moment to take a little detour into some cognitive psychology.
Yep.
So the term schemas represent, or it means how we organise our thinking into frameworks that help us to make sense of the world. And we have to have them because otherwise we wouldn't be able to function effectively as we get older and the world becomes more complex. We need those schemas. Now, children don't have them, because they haven't been around long enough to develop them, which is the reason why they can't function as adults. They have to learn to function as adults. It's because they don't have those schemas. So to say that, we've knocked all the creativity out of them because they've developed these schemas through which to make sense of the world, I think is too simplistic a point of view. What we need to appreciate, and this is why I say we need to we need to invest in our creativity, is that we still need those schemas, right? So we don't want to think like 5-year-olds all the time, otherwise we couldn't, function in the world. We need our schemas to help us as adults to make sense. What we then need on top of that is also some methodologies for breaking the schemas. All right, so for thinking differently, and that's not hard. We learn some creativity tools. Some tools that go, okay, how can you think differently about this? Okay, you've got your established way of solving this problem. Now, here's a tool to help you solve it differently. That's all. So it's not that adults aren't capable of it. It's just that we sometimes need a little bit of help with some creativity tools. Like I use a really simple tool, which is just 4 questions. I call it BODS, B-O-D-S. We can all be creative, B-O-D-S, BODS, meaning people, So B stands for better, asking ourselves the question, is there a better way to do this? So anytime we're working on an issue, and we stop and say, is there a better way to do this? we're actually using our creativity. We're breaking a schema that says this is how we always do it. You're breaking the schema and saying, is there a better way? O stands for other. How have other people solved this problem? So that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. So you go and do some research on who else has solved a similar problem and how have they done it, and then we short-circuit the problem-solving process. D stands for different. What would I see if I looked at this situation from a different point of view? And that's because when we've got our well-developed schemas, we always look at something from a particular perspective, from our perspective, and that's the natural default. So by simply asking ourselves the question, what would we see if we looked at this from a different point of view, it forces us to step outside of our established thinking into a different perspective and analyse the situation from a different viewpoint, and all sorts of incredible things come into view when we do that. Right? So that's a great question to ask ourselves. What does this look like from the perspective of the student if you're the teacher? What does this look like from the perspective of the customer if you're someone making a decision inside a business or an organisation? What does it look like from the perspective of the citizen who's the end user of this process that we're implementing within our government department? They're simple questions, but prompt us into thinking in ways that we wouldn't normally do as a default. And then the final one for that is S stands for simple. Can this process be simplified or streamlined? Because simple is the new smart. And as our world gets more and more complex, I think it's going to be our creativity that will actually help us to pare back and make those complexities simple. Not that everything's going to be simple, of course, but is there a way that we can create more elegant solutions for complex problems instead of constantly just putting patches on patches on patches on patches, so we end up with something that's completely unwieldy? So those 4 questions can be like what we call a pattern interrupt or a heuristic that helps us to think differently. And that's what I mean when I say that that entrepreneurs should invest in their creative thinking. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It can be really simple.
You had another one, number 2, the second one that you talked about.
Yes, the second one was, I think it's really important to invest time in gathering information from really diverse sources. So one of the things that helps an entrepreneur to be a really, a real iconoclast is being a trend spotter. In other words, being able to see what's coming your way before it actually inundates you. And if there's a wave of change, if there's a tsunami of change coming your way and you're not ready for it, well, you'll be wiped out, right? Yeah. So it's too late when the tsunami's already hit to then start madly pedaling, going, oh, we should have started doing this change process 2 years ago. Too late. Okay, you needed to have started thinking about this stuff way before now. So being a trend spotter, I think, is a really important skill for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs as well. But one of the things that helps us to be a trend spotter is to be well informed. So not to become insular about just what's happening inside our organisation or just what's happening inside our industry, but what's happening in the world. What are the global megatrends that are going to wash over us over the next few years? What's happening on the other side of the world that, that's just happening that's going to be us in a year's time. So we need to have our radar out in a way that's going to keep us really well informed about what's inevitably going to impact on us.
So, Irena, you have a book that you showed us earlier. You also are the founder of the Australian Entrepreneur Summit, and you've recently published a magazine or launched a magazine on entrepreneurship. Can you tell us a little bit about how these elements came about? What made you? What was your inspiration behind all this?
Sure, and I'm happy to talk about that too, Hans, because I actually should have mentioned this when I was talking about the creativity aspect. That that's what my PhD is in. That's why I'm working in this space, and I didn't talk about it then. But maybe we can talk a little bit about that now. Okay. All right. So, Hans, I'd love to be able to tell you that I had a grand plan. It was, I'm going to do this, and it's all this grand plan, and I'm going to release the book and then do the magazine and then do the summit, and it's all going to fit together beautifully. It wasn't anything like that. It was about spotting opportunities, identifying when the time is right, and then jumping into the space and just creating my own presence within that space. So, yes, you're right. So I've got the book. I showed you that before. I've got the magazine. And by the way, anyone who's watching, if you would like to subscribe to it, just Google Intrapreneur magazine and it'll take you to the website, and then you can subscribe to that. And indeed, we had the Entrepreneur Summit a couple of weeks ago, last month at the Brisbane Convention Centre. They're all leveraging off each other. So and the reason that I'm doing them in these different ways, and yes, I also can collaborate and I consult in this space, is because I just want to drive this movement through different channels. Some people might like to read a magazine instead of a book. Some people would prefer to go and attend a conference rather than read a book. Some people would prefer to read a book, or some people want to bring me in and work with me internally within their organisations. So they're all leveraging off each other. So the overarching goal is to drive the movement and to make sure that this world taps into the incredible resources that are currently languishing and trapped within our organisations and businesses because of outdated structures and outdated processes and, all of that brilliance that's not being released and liberated, just drives me insane. So this is my way of making a contribution to making sure that we tap into some of that. So just using lots of different channels so that we reach as many different people as possible.
Now, you're a doctor of philosophy, I presume. Was this an area that you did your thesis in?
Yes, so my actual PhD was in creative problem solving in ill-defined situations. So creativity, how do we use our creativity to solve problems when we don't even know what the problem is and we don't know what the solution is? Yep. So it's what we call a wicked problem. And
a what problem?
A wicked problem.
Wicked problem. Okay.
So a wicked problem is a complex problem where when you solve one part of the problem, you inadvertently might end up creating another problem somewhere else, which you couldn't have foreseen. All right, and often government is tasked with solving wicked problems. Climate change, classic wicked problem. You solve one part of it and you create a problem somewhere else. You get rid of a pest here so you can have increased food production, and then down the track you find that you've killed all of the other animals that were contributing to the food production as well. So wicked problems are complex problems that have a lot of moving parts, and there's no right and wrong answer. But just going back to the creativity aspect for a moment. So one of the things I looked at was how people navigate a really ill-defined space. So an ill-defined problem space. So how people change direction with their thinking, how they use the full complement of their cognitive resources, how they use lots of different ways of thinking to solve problems creatively, and not just what is often associated with creative problem solving, which is generation of ideas, right? That's just one small part. And in fact, just as important to the creative problem solving process is also exploration of ideas. It's also assessment and evaluation of ideas, as well as thinking strategically about those ideas. And very often people go, oh, assessment, that's not a creative thinking process. It is part of the process. If we don't apply good evaluation practices to any ideas, we end up with less than optimal outcomes because we haven't used rigor in our selection process and in our thinking. So actually critical thinking is just as important to creativity as generation of new ideas in the ideation process. So that's a topic that's very close to my heart. I spent many years researching how people develop expertise in creatively solving ill-defined problems.
And I can see that leading absolutely into what you're doing in terms of the entrepreneurship. It's core to that whole story.
Exactly.
Particularly also within large companies, because they have lots of moving parts. And how do you navigate those parts? And how do you actually make you stake your claim in that? And
yes,
totally get it. Yeah.
And creativity is the precursor to innovation.
Yes, absolutely.
So people often use creativity and innovation in the same sentence and in the same breath as if they mean the same thing, but they're not. And you won't have innovation unless you've actually got someone who's prepared to think differently and use their creativity to think differently in order to even have something to innovate. So it's a precursor. Some fun facts. Look, I don't know if they're particularly fun, but I can give some interesting facts. So one statistic that I like to quote is that by 2020, which is only next year, technical knowledge will be doubling at the rate of every 73 days.
Wow.
Yeah. So that means that if we use that rate of exponential change in terms of technological development, and we use that rate of change and extrapolate it out to the end of the century, so in 2099, we will have gone through, in this one space of 100 years in this century, we will have experienced something like the equivalent of 20,000 years of technological development. Wow. This century. So if you think about what human beings were doing 20,000 years ago, Cro-Magnon man was hunting wildebeest with spears during the last ice age, which means that people at the end of this century, so your children, my children, our grandchildren, will be looking back at us from their vantage point, and we're going to be looking like we're using spears. That's going to look like a spear. The equivalent of something that's so archaic, so whatever the latest technology is today is going to look to one or two generations from here, it's going to look like a spear. So I think that's a pretty interesting fact. I think it's a remarkable fun fact.
Indeed, it's scary that people can look back on us and if only they knew, that sort of thing. It's
Well, we're on the cusp of some really interesting things about to happen through artificial intelligence, and I'm an old, dyed-in-the-wool science fiction fan. So I was a very avid science fiction reader all through my teenage years and many of my adult years, and it's fascinating to see how much of that science fiction is actually science fact already.
Absolutely.
I think, and I've read a little bit about this, but I don't profess to be an expert on it, but supposedly I don't think we can actually see past about 2045. So that's supposed to be like the event horizon where we really can't predict beyond that what the future is going to look like, because it'll be so vastly different that we can't even conceptualize it right now. So, 2099, totally different world.
Who knows, eh? So in terms of your science fiction, are you a reader or a watcher?
Both. But good science fiction. Yeah. So delving into my foibles here, I've read. Anyone who professes to be a science fiction fan has to have read every single book by Isaac Asimov, great science fiction writer. But I love watching science fiction as well, so I'm going to profess and admit to being a dyed-in-the-wool Star Trek fan, real Trekkie.
Ditto here.
To the extent that I would go to Comic-Con and I lined up when Comic-Con came to Brisbane and William Shatner was in Brisbane, I lined up and got his autograph and had my picture taken with him, because it featured so heavily in my formative years when I was a teenager watching, classic Star Trek. So I love good science fiction. There's a lot of bad science fiction out there too, but good science fiction, I love it.
Whether hardcore.
I don't like science fantasy. I don't like movies that go stray between science fiction and science fantasy. Just give me really hardcore science fiction. I love it. Yeah. So you've extracted that piece of
Indeed.
trivia from me, Hans.
Well, my pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time. And I hope to talk to you very soon again.
Thank you, Hans. It's been wonderful. Probably gone on a bit longer than we expected, but that's because we've had a wonderful rapport and we've really enjoyed the conversation. And I hope that your watchers also find value in it.
I'm sure they will. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye
Bye-bye.
now.